Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to have you here. This is the sixth of the IU talks, but the first of 2018. It's a fabulous opportunity for me, on behalf of the Independent Evaluation Unit, to greet you all, welcome you all, and to wish you a wonderful 2018. Just a few words first on the IU lunch talks that we organize. We organize the Independent Evaluation Unit, which is a relatively new unit in a relatively new organization. Please come. In a relatively new organization, host monthly talks on areas that are related to climate change, development, evaluation, and learning. Essentially, what we want to try through these IU lunch talks is to get a variety of areas of research, of evidence, of understanding, a diversity of them, to create awareness about them, as well as to create dialogue internally as well as externally, because we really believe that high quality evidence is not the domain of just the very few, but needs to be a call for action from amongst the larger and wider community. In the IU talks, the big questions that we try and ask when we look at programs are things that are relevant to program managers. What makes something effective? Why? Under what circumstances? For whom? What are their impacts? How do we know? What are the technologies and methodologies that we can use to make ourselves much more effective as program managers, as strategic thinkers, as development professionals? It's keeping this in mind that we organize these talks, and this is the sixth of our talks from their inception. Our next talk, by the way, just to let you know, is going to be on the 12th of February, and will feature our colleagues from C4. We'll send out a note very soon. But before I go on, I do want to give a couple of things as a description of the talk today, and then, of course, introduce the speaker. So the speaker has about 20 minutes typically to talk about the ideas that she or he want to talk about. We then open it up for hopefully a very enthusiastic dialogue and conversation with all of you. You definitely have the opportunity to follow up after that 1 hour. So the entire session should last an hour. After that 1 hour, to converse bilaterally with her. This talk is recorded. We do put it up on hopefully our website. That will come up soon. We also do. We are also webcasting it, and you're also most welcome to tweet it. GCF _eval is our Twitter handle. So please tweet it, etc., and share these ideas, this talk, any presentation, etc., with people that you know and engage. With that, now I want to introduce our speaker today, as well as the topic. As most of you may know, the previous talk that we had was talking about the wicked problems of climate change. And that essentially underscored for us how important it is to go that last mile. In most program development, in most program strategy, we believe that just supplying information, technology, infrastructure is sufficient for action. But clearly it's not, because there is that last mile, that gap between supply and action by the end user or the beneficiary, that still remains the last mile that we still have to contend with. And program managers and program developers are very, very cognizant of that. Very interestingly for us, Richard Thaler, the winner of the Nobel Prize last year, and previous Nobel Prize winners, Kahneman, for example, Tversky, have done excellent work on what are called behavioral insights. Following up on that tradition, we have our own expert here, and very close by, actually on the 8th floor of this building. Sara Castro-Hallgren is based at the United Nations Environment Program, Division of Technology, Industry and Economics, and works on the Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. I'm going to ask her to quickly introduce herself, but it's really important for you to know that she is also chaired the subgroup on behavioral insights to the United Nations group. And she plays a really important part in sort of galvanizing the United Nations community to think about behavioral insights and how we can take away biases from our daily lives, but also the way we think. In a really telling paper at the World Bank a few months ago, and a paper that I give to all my colleagues when they come and join the IU, is bias amongst policy professionals. It's found essentially that DFID professionals and World Bank professionals, even when provided with objective information, 70% of them make incorrect choices because we all have behavioral biases in our minds. Very similarly, you can be provided actuarially fair insurance. You can be provided information about what the right thing is. Doctors are provided information on why they need to hand wash. We don't act on the information that we have, even though we are extremely bright, well-read, and educated. That's the field of behavioral insights, and I present Sara. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I use this one?
Yeah. Well, either one.
This one.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much for inviting me here today. About 2 years ago, we started a research committee in the Green. I'll just use this one.
Yeah, it's working.
In the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, which is an interdisciplinary platform with the World Bank, the OECD, and the Global Green Growth Institute, as well as UNEP, where I was up to a few months ago. And so what we did was that we started this research committee as well as different research areas in UNEP to focus on the why. Why are we not changing? What are the other things we can do? Because on the supply side, like Joe said, there's a choice architecture. There's all these different things, but sometimes we still don't change. We don't go that last mile. So the demand side is what we wanted to tackle. And consequently, lots of new research has been happening. So we got all these experts together, including the UN Behavioral Science Advisor, advisors from MIT, from the OECD, and other areas that are building what are called behavioral science labs in their own organizations to come together and focus on this interdisciplinary research. And we've launched our first working paper. It will be published next week. And we have it's a working paper, so we have it open for comments if you are interested or would like to get involved and comment on this issue. And it's important because, again, we design and we invest a lot in policies and in programs, a lot of funds, a lot of our own time and resources, but sometimes they just don't achieve the desired effect. Joe asked me to start with something that's relatable to all of us, maybe in our daily life. And so for me, this is my pet peeve, or the thing that I get most annoyed about when I see here on a daily basis. We saw last week serious air pollution challenges, persistent for the whole week. But despite that, I still saw a lot of different individuals, moms, men, youth, others with their cars and their motorcycles, and they have this problem of the idling engine, which releases a lot more carbon emissions than if the engine is active, actually, when it's just idling. So we see that there's traditional policies, signs, command and control policies that try to limit this type of behavior, for example, this habit. But we see that it still doesn't change the behavior. So here's an article from Hong Kong, for example, that the drivers ignore the bans. They still don't change behavior, despite the fact that there is a policy architecture trying to stop that. So why? Why do people ignore that? Why don't they change the behavior? A new study from the UK, for example, looking at evidence, because now we have evidence on this, says that even when you have these eyes, for example, or other types of signs, that may not prompt behavior change, even with the fines or other things. So 20% of motorists at this railway crossing, that's where the evaluation took place, didn't turn off their ignition. But when they saw this sign at the bottom there, where it elicited more self-contemplation, or more self-surveillance, conscience, or an emotional feeling of guilt, for example, or thinking of your own behavior, that directed attention to the individual, and that actually doubled the rate of drivers turning off the engines by 50%. So a very cheap intervention, just a new signage prompt, allowed it to be more effective in changing the habit. So we see that this is kind of how behavioral science can work. It can have a low-cost intervention, change the behavior, and have high impact. Why is this happening today? Why didn't it happen before? Before, I think a lot of us know when we were studying economics, still we relied on these neoclassical models, homo economicus, people are rational, ceteris paribus, these terms. In the real world, they didn't really apply, but still our policies and programs were defined by thinking that people are rational. But now, we see that the policies don't always have the desired impact or as high as we'd want it. The programs may not have the desired impacts either. So what have we learned? We've learned through a lot of different evaluations, a lot of different evidence cases and research that people are irrational, and these biases, they get in the way. They aren't really predictable, but sometimes there is a pattern that you can predict, and that's where these Nobel Prize winners, like Kahneman, and now we see with Richard Thaler's work, they can say, okay, well, there's a pattern here, and we can make our policies more effective. We can have a bigger impact with some simple changes. So why does this matter? How can we use this for our work, for the planet, for pro-environmental behaviors, for the SDGs, or for the climate agreement in Paris? We see that we are officially in what's called the Anthropocene epoch. I don't know if you guys know, but if you look at in 2016, the Geological Congress got together, the IGC, and they said, okay, well, we officially are in the Anthropocene epoch. We've left the Holocene. What does that mean? That means that we have serious markers that started in the 1950s with the Great Acceleration. That's the start of our brown economy. And that officially means that it's an Anthropocene epoch, which is human created, it's human impact. So if it's Anthropocene, that means that our behavior got us here. So I believe that our behavior, changing that behavior, can get us out again. So why does this matter for us? We know we live in, sometimes with complacency, sometimes it just becomes the norm. We live with air pollution, we live with water pollution, plastic particles, microplastics in our water, and we don't change. We have what's called a normalcy bias. That says, okay, it's okay, the ostrich effect, we just adjust. So other research comes out though, like this piece yesterday, which was on the national NPR. We see that there's melting permafrost in the Antarctic. That hasn't even been factored into climate models maybe, so we have lots of new data coming in, and it just continuously, it looks more and more bleak. So what's the answer? Can human behavior help us to reach that 1.5 degree target? Can we change? This is where we kind of fall through the crack that Joe mentioned. We don't change. Sometimes we want to, but sometimes we simply fail, despite our best intentions, despite the values. We have these deep values, these knowledge networks that can be created, the architecture, but for one reason or another, there's a gap between the action. So what can help us to close that gap? Why does that gap happen? It's this. This is the best infographic that we can find in terms of researching and accumulating every single bias that exists, that we know that exists out there. The failure of our brains, for example, to get us to change behavior. So I had 5 copies printed. It's a useful tool for program managers or others to really begin to understand this. And essentially, what does this mean? It means 2 things. It means that our brains, it's a reductionist tool. That's just the way our brain works. It works to process information, break it down, the essentials of what we can remember. We have to act fast, so we also reduce information for that reason. Or sometimes we just need to find quick meaning. So we look for shortcuts. And that's what this summarizes here. But it's helpful because it helps us to see there is a lot of research around and a lot of research showing all the different biases that we have in making our decisions, whether as policymakers, whether as individual consumers, or as CEOs. Why is change so hard? And here we look at the research from the Nobel Prize winners, System 1 and System 2 thinking. So Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, this is what we look at with I don't know how many of you have read Think Fast, Think Slow, the book. This is essentially one of the key outputs from the book. System 1 is our fast thinking. It's the one that is ruled by those biases. Most of the decisions we take on a daily basis are just habits. We don't think too much, we don't deliberate, we don't consciously want to deliberate because that takes more time, more effort, more willpower. That's the system 2. So despite our best efforts, a lot of things will become an automatic choice, a habit. Because we're running, we're trying to do things quickly, and we are creatures of habit. So that means that we rely on rules of thumb to make a lot of decisions. So we have to see how we can make the system one, or the habits, the biases, work for sustainable development, work for tackling climate change. And so the question of evaluation and evidence is so crucial to this, because it shows us what are the behavioral failures, what are the challenges that are impeding us from changing. When all of these policies like taxes, subsidies, information provision, the traditional tools fail, then we can see that evidence from behavioral science can help us increase uptake of green technology, adoption of new methods, new plans, and the use and regularity as well. So this is tackling last mile problems. And the key here is that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So this helps us to make the horse drink. So if you want to break it down. And so the working paper is a start to this. It looks at, we've broken it down like this because green growth, as many of you know, it's a term, but it means the same, that we want our economies to be more sustainable. We want our economies to grow in a way that has less impact on the environment. So how does that start? It starts with microeconomics. It starts with the individual, the household. But the individuals are consumers, and so this unit of analysis is our first tackle here in the paper. It's the first attempt to look at this individual and look at the evidence for green growth. And so that's what we've done. We focus on the individual at the bottom there, but we hope that the further research will focus on organizations, corporations, which I'll talk about now, and governments as a whole, the policies that can be changed as a whole. The household is also important, but that systemic approach is where you can create change at scale, with the corporation, for example. I think it's not here. So, at the individual level, this is central to us because we can see that individuals have an aggregate impact on the economy, whether it's by purchases, whether it's by dietary habits, or many others. This is a figure, a study that's cited in the paper, which I shared with Joe before, and it's important because in developed economies, where a lot of the research has focused on so far, it shows us that these are the behavioral changes that individuals can make with the most impact to reduce our effects on climate change. The first one is a highly personal choice. I think we know it's reducing population growth, having one less child. The second one is living car-free. That's also a behavioral choice. Avoiding one transatlantic flight, or buying green energy, and then etc. Eating a plant-based diet. So reducing our meat consumption. These are the impacts, and these are the behavioral choices that we can make that have the most potential for change, but in a developed economy. The research is not there for those other countries that we know are central to climate change impacts in these next 15 years. Countries like India, for example, are quickly changing their consumption of meat. China has already done so, and many other countries will do it, because the more middle-class consumers we have, the more impact they have on consumption of things like meat, because it's a lifestyle choice, but it's a habit that's also created. So what we also see is that there's greater impacts on plastic consumption. These are the markers of middle-class consumption, having a car, etc. So for the future, these are behavioral choices where we don't have to go through the linear path of lifestyles or behavior choices that we went through in the Western countries, in the US, for example, but we can skip over, like China is doing with a lot of policy commitments, skip over to using other types of behavior choices as the default. The strongest tool is this default choice. We work in a system. So for example, the idling engine problem that I mentioned in the beginning. A lot of car companies have made this a default technology in cars already. So this is an example of how a corporation can change the choice architecture and set the sustainable choice or the better choice as the default. You can opt out. A lot of times we know you can opt out to stop using the start-stop function. But The status quo bias works for us in this case because many people won't do that. They won't take that extra step to opt out of the sustainable, or to say, I don't want this feature in the car, etc. So the default choice can be made the best choice, and that's the most powerful tool that we can use from a choice architecture setting, from a corporate setting, for example, or a country setting this as the default choice. It can be controversial because who's to say we have to limit consumption or limit choices, right? But it requires a policy commitment from either the car corporation or the government to say we are taking the extra step and we're going to do this for the sustainable reasons, or XYZ as the new and best technology in this case. Another step that is being taken by the car industry, we see that Volvo is setting the choice architecture and setting the electric or hybrid as the default option as of 2019. So this is again an example of why it's important to work with corporations to make these the default choices. Another key solution or key tool that the paper emphasizes is that while we have a lot of social norms, and social norms are really powerful, it's what guides our decisions. A lot of times what can prevent us from taking that extra step to change the behavior. We don't want to go against the social norm. There are key biases that prevent us from doing that. So a research study at Stanford found that people are twice as likely to order a meatless meal when there are cafeteria signs noting that norms are changing. People are changing their habits. Join the club. Get with or keep up with the Joneses is one of the terms. You know, get on the bandwagon. Conform. Follow the herd. These are behavioral biases. And because it's interdisciplinary, this field, different psychology or others may have different terms, but this is sort of the four. They're very powerful tools to move the herd, so to say, because we do work that way. So we can show that habits are changing, we can use dynamic norms, and the most crucial thing is to do that at the point of sale, research finds. So at the point of decision making, that's where you provide the information in an effective way. And then the biases can work for us. They can work to prompt changes in our behavior and reduce meat consumption, for example. So another key solution that the paper emphasizes is from a wonderful book. It's called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And what he's done is that he breaks down our habits into habit loops. This is how we work. The system one that I mentioned, it's habits. We don't think, we just make the choices. Why? Because we get into a loop, a routine, and it's prompted by a cue. A cue, for example, can be, oh, you see someone smoking, time for me to smoke, I follow my routine, I will smoke. Or you see a sign for a burger, it's time for lunch, cue, I buy the burger, the routine, you have your lunch, the reward, your craving is satisfied for the burger. The same with a coffee cup. We can see that can be disrupted, for example, if you have an incentive or a new reward. A new reward can be, you get a star at the coffee store, or your name is recognized for being the sustainable consumer of the month. A 5% of an incentive, a financial incentive, can now be something that can prompt a reward, or other nudges, which are non-financial incentives, can prompt behavior change. But the idea is to have a cue that disrupts this, and a routine that replaces it, and a reward that is the sustainable, prompting the sustainable habit loop. So better choices. The report finds that among all the cases, there's 27 cases that are evaluated in the report. And the most successful cases were the ones that removed hassle factors. Why? Because frankly speaking, we are lazy. We do not like hassles. We opt for convenience a lot of time. That is something that helps us to change our behavior when things are convenient. We look for these shortcuts, right? So the most successful cases were the ones that removed the hassle factors, that changed the context to disrupt that habit loop that I just mentioned, or that provided the information in a new way to change the perceptions, like the Stanford study with the meatless option. And then the last one is when you allowed people to self-organize or in groups. Why? Because that's, again, that herding behavior. When the group is changing, then others can change more quickly. So that conformity bias will work for us. People want to conform. So one of the key cases that I thought could be useful to highlight is smart grid technology, for example. This is an example of how the default option was set as the key option for a group of people, a group of consumers, And that one was the most successful study, the most successful tool. Why? Because people didn't want to go the extra mile of opting out. They didn't want to be seen as opting out of the sustainable technology. So that was set as the default. We're installing smart grid, you're a part of it, get on board, and people didn't opt out in that case. So this framing led to the highest uptake of smart grid technology. This example. Again, this is from a study done in Denmark, Norway, and Switzerland. So we need more studies like this to be done in developing countries. This one is for water purification in Kenya. And this is, again, the removal of hassle factors. When the chlorine was placed next to the point of collection for water, it was used more readily, more quickly, and more habitually. So it became a habit to use the chlorine. Even though people knew the benefits of putting the chlorine into it, they didn't want to go the extra mile of doing it because it wasn't placed conveniently next to the point of collection. So when that was changed in a highly visible location next to the water collection point, then it became a cue and a habit, and the uptake was greater. The paper also presents a conceptual framework. Why? Because sometimes it's very difficult to do this, so what we have done is we've organized it into steps and questions, key questions that a program designer or policymaker may wish to ask themselves when they want to define the key priorities. So what is my key behavior that I need to change in my economy? What's the most destructive one? Or what's the lowest hanging fruit? Sometimes it can be easier to have a proof of concept with the lowest hanging fruit, as opposed to maybe the most destructive behavior in the city or in the economy. So that's the first key step. The next one is to define the level of intervention, the target audience, because it's very important to know why are people engaging in that behavior. Is it the social norms? Is it other things that are preventing them from change? So we also recommend doing a diagnostic of current behavior. And then looking at the adoptions, the habits, and the tools that you can use. What's new about behavioral science is that it often recommends the use of what's called a randomized controlled trial. Borrowing from the medical sciences field, randomized controlled trials can help us. But you can also use a survey or other different tools to evaluate and increase adoption and examine that. And then horizontal expansion, scale up. We have these findings, like we see, can we apply them to all these different countries and contexts? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We need to be very careful about that because we don't know why, what may work for the UK may not work for Fiji, for example. So we need to examine. And then in closing, the knowledge gaps and next steps. The paper recommends some of these. Again, a lot of the findings are for developed countries. We recommend looking at key behaviors that need to change in certain countries, what that needs to be researched, which ones are the most destructive or most negative ones, the priority ones for climate change, for example. Also, the tipping point. We need to track progress. This is my key area. I really advocate for this. And moving beyond individuals to these corporate behavior changes. What can corporations, which have these large effects around the world with supply chains, with value chains, what can they do? What can governments do at scale, for example? And as I mentioned, which are the key norms? What can are we changing fast enough? We need to track this. Is it happening quickly enough to reach a 1.5 target or a 3-degree target? And what is the tipping point? When do we know that our economy has changed in a country, for example? When do we know that it is a sustainable one that has the key behaviors in place? So we know that social norms are difficult to change as a whole. That's the holy grail, basically. But we know that they can have large impacts. So that's our end goal, and that's what we advocate. Thank you.
Thanks, Sara, very much. So one of the, this is sort of a circuitous question, but the way that I found Sara is quite interesting. We were organizing, the IU was organizing a conversation on behavioral insights and last mile sort of questions at a conference in Istanbul. And I knew that the Obama administration had set up a behavioral insights team. So I got in touch with them and wanted to find out who was leading it so that they could come and speak at our events. They weren't available, and after 5 degrees of separation, and many emails, I was put in touch with Sara. And she said, oh, so where are you located? I'm sorry, I'm very far away in the world. And I said, well, so am I. Where are you? And we find out we're in the same building. So that sort of leads me to the question, Sara, that also I think that Behavioral Insights team had to deal with, which unfortunately has been now disbanded in the new administration. But I know that they had to deal with a lot of questions around, well, behavioral insights can also be fairly paternal in that you're really brainwashing a population to think along a certain line, right? And so you're taking away choice. So I wanted you to address that question perhaps head on. And my second question was going to be, can you talk a little bit about the other criticism that also comes this way, which is that a lot of these changes tend to be temporary. Yeah, you can put up a poster as in the Stanford experiment that, norms are changing, etc. But I go into that cafeteria, I have a vegetarian burger, and then I move out and I switch back to my beef burger. So can you talk a little bit about both of those? Thanks.
Yes. So, so on the first question of the paternalism, I think, yes, that question can come up, but I want to make one point that I forgot to make, and that's that corporations have been doing this for years through marketing. We got to this because in a lot of cases, this was done through marketing for either sugary diets, for example, movies, Hollywood films promoting a certain lifestyle, or others, promoting a certain norm. And so the key, which speaks to the second question, is to change the social norms. And that's why in my new position with the UN project on governance here, we have a project office that has been established with the Ministry of Interior of Korea, the Ministry of Interior and Safety. And so that's looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, because that's our framework. So if we can show the key behaviors that under the Sustainable Development Goals need to be changed, then I think that we are just following the agreed framework in terms of what we need to change for the Paris Agreement under SDG 13 or for any other challenges. That's not to say that certain governments may not use this for other priorities, but this is a government decision. As the UN, I advocate that we need to use this for the Sustainable Development Goals and to make sure that we stay within a 1.5 degree target, if that's possible. So that's our challenge. And then in the second point of social norms, I think that's where we can ensure that things are more sustainable. Because if we can see, for example, not to bring this in here, but the Me Too campaign, will that change social norms or will that just be temporary? That's a key question. So how do you make sure that it is sustainable? And that's why I emphasize the default choice as one of the key areas, because we live within a choice architecture that's determined by the infrastructure, by the different products that we can access in a certain country. Here, I don't have access to a lot of sustainably certified products with the label that I would know. For example, the FSC label, Forest Stewardship Council. I don't see that on many paper products. So I don't know, I could be contributing to deforestation in Indonesia. I don't know. I don't have the choice. So how can we make it the default choice? And that's the key, making it the default choice, changing the social norm.
Thank you. So this is that bewitching hour, and we start with Stefan, but anyone else? So we'll do 3 questions at a time so that you can try and answer those in groups. So Stefan first.
You almost stole something from my questions, but let's come from a different angle to it. Because I had the same thought. On behavior, it comes pretty late. Behavior is a consequence from thinking. Thinking is a consequence from thinking patterns. And I would argue that to be really sustainable, you need to work at the education level. That the young kids already develop this kind of category 2 thinking level, that it's conscious, rational, and then everything would evolve on its own, I would say. Because it's kind of nudging. I think one needs to do it just to counter this, what the commercial sector is doing in the wrong way. For that reason alone, this kind of research is important. But I would